April 4th, 1884. In the snow-swept city of Nagaoka in northern Japan, a schoolmaster named Sadayoshi Takano welcomed his seventh child into a world on the verge of transformation. The boy's name was Isoroku, meaning 56, reflecting his father's age at his birth. But this child, born into a declining samurai family, would rise to command the most powerful naval force in the Pacific and alter the course of world history. Young Isoroku grew up on tales of the Echigo clan's battles during Japan's tumultuous unification decades earlier. His family embodied the old warrior code of Bushido, yet lived in genteel poverty as the feudal age crumbled around them. The boy listened to stories of honor, sacrifice, and service to the emperor, values that would define every decision of his life. At 16, driven by a desire to serve his nation in its new modern military, Isoroku applied to the Imperial Naval Academy at Etajima. Out of 300 applicants, he scored second highest. The rigorous program forbade drinking, smoking, and any social contact with women. Discipline was absolute. The fourth year was spent at sea, learning naval warfare not from textbooks, but from the rolling decks of Japan's growing fleet. In 1904, Ensign Isoroku Takano graduated 7th in his class and immediately entered a conflict that would shape Japan's destiny and his own. The Russo-Japanese War had erupted, and Japan faced the supposedly invincible Russian Empire. On May 27, 1905, during the Battle of Tsushima Strait, the 21-year-old ensign stood aboard the cruiser Nishin when a Russian shell struck his ship. The explosion knocked him unconscious. When he awoke in the ship's medical bay, his left hand was mangled, 2 fingers gone forever. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen and leg. For 2 months, he lay in a military hospital, bearing his injuries with the stoic courage expected of a naval officer. But this young man, who would be nicknamed 80 sen by geisha girls because a manicure cost 100 sen and he only had 8 fingers, carried more than physical scars from that battle. In 1916, after proving himself as a capable officer and instructor, the young commander was adopted by the Yamamoto family, a higher-ranking samurai clan without male heirs. Isoroku Takano became Isoroku Yamamoto, a name that would echo through history. But his most transformative experience was yet to come. In 1919, at 35 years old, Commander Yamamoto stepped off a ship in Boston Harbor with orders to attend Harvard University as a special student. For the next 2 years, he would receive an education that no military academy could provide. He would learn what America truly was. At Harvard, Yamamoto studied English and economics, but his real education happened outside the classroom. He became an obsessive poker player, often staying up all night at the card table, winning hand after hand. But what fascinated him wasn't just the game itself, it was the American mindset it revealed. The aggressive betting, the calculated risks, the ability to bluff and read opponents. Years later, as an attaché in Washington, he would play poker with American military officers, developing what one historian called contempt for the mental agility of some opponents. But more importantly, he was studying American strategic thinking at the poker table. During summer breaks, Yamamoto didn't rest. He hitchhiked across America, a Japanese naval officer with a battered backpack, crisscrossing the vast continent. He visited oil fields in Texas and Mexico, studying America's energy infrastructure with the keen eye of a naval strategist who knew that modern warfare ran on petroleum. He walked through Ford automobile plants, witnessing assembly lines that could produce thousands of vehicles with mechanical efficiency. He stood in steel mills in Pittsburgh, watching molten metal pour into molds that would become the bones of American ships and buildings. What Yamamoto saw terrified him. Japan was an island nation with limited natural resources, dependent on imports for its industrial survival. America was a continental power with seemingly limitless oil, steel, coal, and agricultural capacity. Japan's entire industrial output could be swallowed by a single American state. The numbers were stark and undeniable. From 1926 to 1928,
Now a captain, Yamamoto returned to America as the naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. He traveled extensively, visiting more factories, more oil installations, more of the sprawling infrastructure that revealed America's terrifying potential. He spoke fluent English, understood American culture, and had developed genuine respect for the nation's capabilities. But he had also gained something more dangerous than knowledge. He had formed an opinion that contradicted everything the militarists in Tokyo wanted to believe. Yamamoto became convinced that Japan could not defeat the United States in a prolonged war. The industrial and resource disparity was simply too vast. Any conflict with America would have to be short, decisive, and aimed at forcing negotiations before American industry fully mobilized. Back in Japan, Captain Yamamoto's career continued to rise, even as his nation lurched toward catastrophe. In 1924, recognizing that the future of naval warfare lay in aviation, he changed his specialty from gunnery to naval aviation. He took command of the aircraft carrier Akagi and became one of Japan's foremost experts on carrier tactics. While traditionalists still believed in massive battleships as the foundation of naval power, Yamamoto saw that aircraft carriers would dominate future conflicts. By 1933, as a rear admiral, he headed the entire Navy Aviation Bureau, directing Japan's air program with innovative thinking. He pushed for more training, better aircraft, and the development of tactics that would later shock the world. But as his professional star rose, his political position became increasingly dangerous. Japan in the 1930s was gripped by militaristic fervor. The army, more aggressive and expansionist than the navy, drove the nation toward conflict in Asia. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the brutal war in China, the growing alliance with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, Yamamoto opposed all of it, not from pacifism, but from pragmatic calculation. He knew where this path led.
In December 1936, Yamamoto was appointed Vice Minister of the Japanese Navy. From this powerful position, he argued passionately against the policies consuming his nation. He opposed the invasion of Manchuria. He opposed the military alliance with Germany and Italy. He saw these moves as provocations that would inevitably draw Japan into a war it couldn't win. When Japanese aircraft attacked the USS Panay, an American gunboat on the Yangtze River in December 1937, Yamamoto did something unprecedented. He personally apologized to the American ambassador. For a high-ranking Japanese officer to apologize to a Western power was seen as humiliating, even treasonous by hardline militarists. Death threats poured in. The entire naval ministry had to be placed under constant guard. Right-wing assassins had already murdered several moderate politicians. Now Yamamoto was in their sights. But when confronted about the danger, his response embodied the samurai code he'd absorbed since childhood. To die for emperor and nation is the highest hope of a military man. After a brave, hard fight, the blossoms are scattered on the fighting field. One man's life or death is a matter of no importance. He would not be silenced by threats. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally joining the Axis powers. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, knowing Yamamoto's expertise and concerns, asked him directly, if war came with the United States, what would be the outcome? Yamamoto's answer would become his most famous statement. If I am told to fight, then in the first 6 months to a year of war against the United States and England, I will run wild, and I will show you an uninterrupted succession of victories. But I must tell you that should the war be prolonged for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory. This wasn't false modesty or careful political maneuvering. This was cold, mathematical reality, delivered by a man who had walked America's industrial heartland and understood what Japan faced. When shown studies indicating Japan could fight for only 18 months before running out of resources, Yamamoto replied grimly, "It's the same as my own studies." But his warnings fell to deaf ears. The army dominated Japanese policy, and they were convinced of 2 fatal illusions: that American resolve was weak, and that a quick series of victories would force the United States to negotiate a settlement rather than fight a long war. The militarists believed Americans were soft, divided, and unwilling to sacrifice for a conflict in distant Asia. Yamamoto knew better.
He had played poker with Americans, hitchhiked across their country, seen their factories and oil fields. He knew their capacity for industrial warfare and their fierce pride once provoked. But the decision for war was made above him, driven by a desperate need for oil and resources after the United States imposed crippling economic sanctions in July 1941. On August 30th, 1939, Yamamoto was promoted to full admiral and appointed commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. He was now the most powerful naval officer in Japan, commanding the instrument that would carry out whatever war plan Tokyo demanded. And if war was inevitable, if his warnings would be ignored and his nation would plunge into a conflict he knew it couldn't win, then Admiral Yamamoto would do his duty. He would plan an attack so audacious, so devastating, that it might give Japan the slim chance his cold calculations suggested was possible. In May 1940, during routine naval exercises, Yamamoto watched as warships maneuvered to avoid aerial torpedo attacks. Even experienced Japanese pilots struggled to score decisive hits. But Yamamoto's strategic mind saw something his staff officers missed. He turned to them and remarked, "An even more crushing blow could be struck against an unsuspecting enemy force by mass torpedo attack." He was thinking about Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had relocated from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in May 1940, a move intended to deter Japanese expansion. But to Yamamoto, this concentration of American naval power in a single harbor presented a stunning opportunity. If Japan could destroy the Pacific Fleet before the war truly began, America would be crippled in the Pacific for months, perhaps long enough for Japan to seize the oil and resources of Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter too costly for America to breach. The inspiration came from an unlikely source. On November 11-12, 1940, the British Royal Navy launched a daring raid on the Italian fleet anchored at Taranto Harbor. Approximately 20 Fairey Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers from HMS Illustrious attacked at night, sinking several Italian battleships in shallow water using specially modified torpedoes. The raid proved that even in shallow harbors, capital ships could be destroyed from the air. Yamamoto immediately ordered detailed reports from Japanese naval attachés in Rome and London. He studied every aspect of the British attack. Pearl Harbor's depth was similar to Taranto. If torpedoes could be modified to run shallow, if pilots could be trained for this precision attack, if surprise could be maintained, it could work. But the obstacles were formidable. Pearl Harbor was over 3,500 miles from Japan, far beyond conventional operations. Achieving complete surprise was essential, yet moving a carrier strike force across the Pacific without detection seemed impossible. Japanese naval doctrine called for a decisive fleet battle in home waters, not a preemptive strike in the enemy's territory. The Naval General Staff resisted the plan as too risky, too complex, too dependent on factors beyond Japanese control. Yamamoto refused to back down. In summer 1941, Japan developed the Mark 95 torpedo, capable of running in the shallow 40-foot depths of Pearl Harbor. Pilots trained relentlessly for the attack, practicing at Kagoshima Bay, where geography mimicked Hawaii. Strike Force Commander Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was briefed on the operation, codenamed Operation Z, later known as Operation Hawaii. When the Naval General Staff continued to resist, Yamamoto played his trump card. He was the most popular and respected admiral in Japan, a hero to the fleet. He threatened to resign as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet if the plan wasn't approved. It was professional blackmail, and it worked. On November 3, 1941, the Fleet Forces Command approved Yamamoto's plan. On November 22, 6 carriers, Agaki, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, gathered at remote Tonkan Bay in the Kuril Islands. Vice Admiral Nagumo commanded what would become known as the Kido Butai, the Mobile Striking Force. On November 26th, maintaining strict radio silence, the fleet departed for a waiting area in the North Pacific. On December 1st, they received the final attack order. The message was simple: climb Mount Niitaka. War was confirmed. The fleet turned toward Hawaii. December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. Sailors on Battleship Row prepared for a leisurely weekend. At 0600 hours, 230 miles north of Oahu, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft launched from the carrier decks of the Kido Butai. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the strike. 49 high-altitude bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, and 43 fighters. The second wave of 167 aircraft followed shortly after. At 0758 hours, Fuchida radioed the code word Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Surprise was complete. What happened next shocked the world. For 2 hours, Japanese aircraft hammered the unprepared Pacific Fleet. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbor at 50 feet, releasing their modified weapons with devastating accuracy. Dive bombers screamed down on battleships and cruisers, their bombs punching through armored decks. Fighters strafed airfields where American planes sat wingtip to wingtip, easy targets, destroyed before they could take off. The carnage was catastrophic. The battleship USS Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, killing 1,177 men in an instant. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors in her overturned hull. The West Virginia, California, and Nevada were sunk or seriously damaged. The Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee suffered heavy damage. 11 other warships were destroyed or crippled. On nearby airfields, 188 American aircraft were destroyed and 159 damaged. 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 wounded. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and 64 men. By military standards, the attack was a stunning tactical success. In one morning, Japan had crippled America's Pacific battleship fleet and seized the initiative across the Pacific. While Pearl Harbor burned, Japanese forces simultaneously attacked British Malaya, Thailand, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam. Within 6 months, Japan would control an empire stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific. News of the attack electrified Japan. Admiral Yamamoto was hailed as a genius, the Horatio Nelson of Japan. His face appeared on newspapers and posters. Children sang songs about the great victory. The admiral could, as he'd promised, run wild in the opening phase of the war. But Yamamoto felt no triumph. As reports came in, he noted what hadn't been destroyed. The Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise, were at sea and untouched. The massive oil tank farms at Pearl Harbor, containing 4.5 million barrels of fuel, remained intact. The repair facilities, submarine pens, and administrative buildings survived. Vice Admiral Nagumo had withdrawn after the second wave, judging further attacks too risky. Yamamoto knew Nagumo had failed to deliver the decisive blow. The American Pacific Fleet was damaged but not destroyed. The carriers, the future of naval warfare, were operational. And more ominously, initial intelligence reports from Tokyo told of American public reaction. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's words before Congress on December 8 captured the fury sweeping across America. The attack had done precisely what Yamamoto feared most. It had united a divided nation in unprecedented rage and determination. Americans who had resisted involvement in World War II now clamored for revenge. Within days, recruitment offices were overwhelmed with volunteers. Factory workers pledged to work around the clock. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was enraged. Yamamoto's strategic calculations were correct, but his hope that a decisive blow might persuade America to negotiate was catastrophically wrong. The surprise nature of the attack, striking without a declaration of war, was seen as treacherous. "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a battle cry that would echo for 4 years. And America's industrial might, which Yamamoto had witnessed firsthand, began its awesome mobilization. Automobile factories converted to tank and aircraft production. Shipyards that had built a handful of vessels a year now laid down carriers and battleships at an assembly line pace. Women entered the workforce by millions. Rationing began. The nation prepared for total war. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, the strategic situation Yamamoto had feared began to materialize. Japan's conquests had been spectacular. The Philippines, Dutch East Indies, Singapore, Burma, most of New Guinea, and countless Pacific islands fell to Japanese forces. But each conquest spread Japanese forces thinner. Supply lines lengthened, and across the Pacific, American forces prepared to strike back. Yamamoto understood the clock was ticking. His prophecy of 6 months to a year of success was playing out exactly as he'd predicted. But what came after that window? He needed another decisive victory, another stunning blow to force American negotiators to the table before the full weight of American industry crushed Japan. He planned for that decisive battle at a small atoll called Midway. In April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's raid on Tokyo using B-25 bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet achieved minimal physical damage but dealt a devastating psychological blow. Japan itself had been attacked, the sacred home islands violated. For a nation raised to believe its homeland was invincible, the humiliation was intolerable. The raid accelerated Yamamoto's planning for a decisive battle. He chose Midway Island, a small atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The strategy was brilliant on paper. Invade Midway, drawing out the American carriers to defend this vital outpost, then annihilate them with superior Japanese naval forces. Yamamoto assembled a massive armada, 250 ships, including 8 carriers, the largest naval force assembled by Japan during the war. But the plan was fatally complex. Yamamoto divided his forces into multiple groups hundreds of miles apart: a diversionary attack on Alaska's Aleutian Islands, a carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Nagumo to neutralize Midway's defenses, an invasion force to occupy the atoll, and Yamamoto's main battle fleet held in reserve. Coordinating these disparate elements with 1942 communications technology was extraordinarily difficult. And Yamamoto had made a critical error in his intelligence assessment. He believed only one American carrier had survived the Battle of Coral Sea in May. In reality, though damaged, the carrier Yorktown had made it back to Pearl Harbor, where repair crews performed near miraculous work, returning her to service in just 72 hours instead of the projected 3 months. But the most catastrophic failure was one Yamamoto couldn't have imagined. The Japanese naval code JN-25 had been broken by American cryptanalysts. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HY in Pearl Harbor's basement had been reading Japanese naval communications for months. They knew a major operation was planned for early June. They knew the target was designated AF. In a brilliant ruse, American commanders ordered Midway to send an unencrypted radio message reporting fresh water system problems. When Japanese communications quickly reported AF was short of fresh water, the Americans had their confirmation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, knew Yamamoto's entire plan. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the barely repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway, at a location optimistically codenamed Point Luck. The Japanese expected no carriers. Instead, they sailed into an ambush. On June 4, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway began. Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island while American land-based bombers attacked the Japanese fleet with limited success. Then, in a span of 5 minutes that changed the Pacific War, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with fuel lines strung across their decks, aircraft armed and fueled, ready to launch. The carriers were floating bombs. The devastation was total. Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship, erupted in flames. Kaga exploded, her stored munitions detonating in a chain reaction. Soryu burned uncontrollably. Later that day, American aircraft located and destroyed the 4th carrier, Hiryu. In one day, Japan lost 4 frontline carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and irreplaceable veteran pilots. Yamamoto, watching from his flagship Yamato, realized the magnitude of the disaster. His complex plan had collapsed. His strategy of a decisive battle had worked, but Japan had been decisively defeated. He ordered a withdrawal. The 6-month window of Japanese supremacy had closed exactly as he'd predicted. After Midway, the strategic initiative passed to the Allies. Japan's industrial base couldn't replace the lost carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots fast enough. American shipyards, meanwhile, were producing Essex-class carriers at a rate Japan couldn't match. The war of attrition Yamamoto had warned about had begun, and the mathematics were brutal. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning a 6-month campaign of savage fighting. Yamamoto committed Japanese forces piecemeal to the battle, unable to mass the concentrated force needed for victory. Each engagement bled his fleet further. The night surface battles around Guadalcanal, known as Iron Bottom Sound for the number of ships sunk there, were tactically brilliant but strategically futile. Yamamoto knew the truth. Japan was losing. Each month, American industrial output increased. New carriers joined the fleet. Advanced aircraft rolled off production lines. Meanwhile, Japan's merchant fleet was being systematically destroyed by American submarines, strangling the resource imports the nation desperately needed. The oil from the Dutch East Indies, the rubber from Malaya, the raw materials from conquered territories, they couldn't reach Japan if the transport ships were at the bottom of the Pacific. By early 1943, the strain showed in Yamamoto's face. Photographs from this period show a man aged beyond his years, the weight of his nation's failing war crushing him. He moved his headquarters forward to Rabaul on New Britain, closer to the fighting, hoping his presence would bolster morale. In April, he planned an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands to personally congratulate pilots on their combat performance.
It was a fatally routine decision. On April 14, 1943, multiple American radio intercept stations copied a Japanese naval message. The routine communication was forwarded to Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor, where Commander Rochefort's cryptanalysts went to work. Within hours, they had decoded something extraordinary: Admiral Yamamoto's complete travel itinerary for April 18th. The message was remarkably detailed. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0600 hours in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, accompanied by a second bomber carrying his chief of staff, and escorted by 6 Zero fighters. He would arrive at Balalay Airfield near Bougainville at precisely 0745 hours. The architect of Pearl Harbor, punctual as always, had given the Americans his exact schedule. The intelligence reached Admiral Nimitz, who faced a difficult decision. Killing Yamamoto would tip off the Japanese that their codes had been broken, potentially costing America a priceless intelligence advantage. On the other hand, removing Japan's most capable naval commander could be strategically decisive. Moreover, there was the matter of revenge. Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor. American public opinion demanded payback. The decision went to President Roosevelt via Navy Secretary Frank Knox. The order came back: get Yamamoto. The task fell to Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, whose forces operated in the Solomons. Halsey gave the mission to Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding aircraft in the Solomons. The problem was range. The target area was 435 miles from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. A circuitous route to avoid Japanese radar added another 200 miles. The round trip of over 1,000 miles exceeded the range of every available fighter except one. The P-38 Lightning, with external fuel tanks, could barely make the journey. Major John Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron, began planning what was designated Operation Vengeance. 18 P-38s would make the attempt. 4 in a killer flight led by Captain Thomas Lanphier to attack the bombers, the rest providing fighter cover. Mitchell calculated the odds of even spotting Yamamoto's flight at 1,000 to 1. April 18, 1943, Palm Sunday, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had humiliated Japan. At 0715 hours, 16 P-38s, 2 spares returned with mechanical problems, lifted off from Henderson Field. Major Mitchell navigated only using a map, compass, and his wristwatch, flying at wave-top height for over 2 hours to avoid radar detection. In Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto, wearing an Army khaki uniform, boarded his G4M bomber. His white-gloved hand gripped his katana sword, a gift from his deceased brother. Admiral Matome Ugaki, his chief of staff, boarded the second bomber. 6 Zero fighters took position as escorts. At 0600 hours, the small formation departed for Bougainville. The Japanese flew at 4,500 feet in clear weather. They expected no threat. American fighters couldn't reach this far from Guadalcanal. They were wrong. At 934 hours, 1 minute ahead of schedule, Mitchell's navigation proved flawless. Lieutenant Douglas Canning spotted the Japanese formation descending through light haze. The P-38s jettisoned their fuel tanks and climbed to attack altitude. What they found stunned them. Instead of the expected massive fighter escort, only 6 Zeros protected the two bombers. Japanese overconfidence had proven fatal.